Warning: the following content has been rated extreme. Some images and language may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. And now, Love Wrestling presents The Legacy of ECW. By 1994, it was pretty clear where the professional wrestling world was headed. Gone were the days of territory-based wrestling and more into the days of global-based wrestling with a landscape on cable television. This was not something that was of the norm, but something that was becoming the norm with Monday Night Raw starting in 1993 on the USA Network, and Nitro certainly following suit a little later on. But in 1994, something else would happen, and a clear number 3 would be established in the later years. Something that we weren't expecting from the NWA and Eastern Championship Wrestling was bringing a different kind of style into professional wrestling in the North American world, and I don't think a lot of people were truly ready or really able to grasp the concept of how this would work on a worldwide scale. While the WWF at the time, now WWE, and WCW were certainly presenting a more family-like atmosphere in 1994, Paul Heyman would have other ideas. In 1994, he decided to step away from the traditional style of wrestling, probably irritating a lot of different people within the wrestling world, and step into more of a reality-based and contemporary style of professional wrestling, or at least the way it was presented. In a society led by the peak of MTV in the mid-90s, Paul Heyman decided that it was time to bring in something a little more edgy and a little different to professional wrestling and go away from the standard style of just character-based wrestling and bring in a more reality-based wrestling to the North American audience, showcasing different kinds of wrestling like lucha libre, Japanese style of wrestling, and of course be forefronted by the hardcore wrestling style. How this would be done is beyond anybody's dreams at this point, but Heyman had other plans. He wanted to make this the best it could be on a very lower budget than something like WWF and Vince McMahon and WCW and Ted Turner. This was going to be different. This was going to be edgy. This was going to be hardcore. This was going to be extreme. On August 30th, 1994, the now infamous throwdown of the NWA World Heavyweight Championship by Shane Douglas has been seen in many different video packages and documentaries on ECW's past. On this night, Douglas threw down the NWA World Heavyweight Championship belt, stating he did not want to be the champion of a dead promotion that died 7 years ago. He then raised the Eastern Championship Wrestling title belt and declared it to be the World Heavyweight Championship, calling it the only real world title left in professional wrestling. The spiral of the moment with Shane Douglas would really start to come into the effect a little later on in the mid-90s. Now, the bulk of ECW shows remained at the ECW Arena, which was essentially just a giant warehouse. The seating was simply folding chairs. It was different kinds of just very basic things. Now, I don't mean basic in a really horrible way, it's just how that was. It was reflective of that gritty, edgy style of the actual promotion itself. Now remember, ECW behind WWF and WCW was not financially competing with them. It was not a thing that they were doing. But Paul Heyman and the ECW team realized this. They realized this really fast, that said, instead of trying to all compete with any kind of production value that WWF or WCW can do, let's make this gritty. Let's make this look a little more edgy. Let's make this reflective of what the 90s were all about, especially in the mid-90s. It was grunge. It was edgy. It was gritty. It was real. It was raw. That's what the 90s were all about. Look at the music world in the 90s. One of the most popular bands at that time was Nirvana. That's how big and the cultural kind of impact that kind of grittiness had on the world at the time. And ECW were very much the finger on the pulse when it comes to what the world is saying about entertainment. MTV was at the forefront and was at its peak in the mid-90s. That's what ECW wanted to bring to professional wrestling. If you look at WWF, if you look at WCW, they were doing things that were very kid-friendly, that were very much like Saturday morning cartoonish in the sense of very character-driven, very over-the-top gimmicks. When ECW had a lot of people within the promotion, all throughout their time, of reality-based, real-life people. They were more regular Joes, quote-unquote, than what, say, WWF or WCW was doing, especially WCW in the earlier part. And we kind of moved away into the Attitude Era, which we're going to get to in just a second. But ECW would have this gritty style and would really promote it because they were on syndication, they were on different kinds of networks throughout their times in the mid-90s, but they were airing at 2 a.m. They were airing at 3 a.m., mostly due to language, violence, and the use of copyrighted music and music videos. Because they were on so early in the morning, they were kind of getting away with a lot more saying if they were on at prime time. If they were on at prime time, they weren't able to do the things that they were doing in that time and on their programming. It was insane, some of the stuff that they were doing throughout this time in 94, 95, 96, and beyond. They were doing so many wild things that was never seen in professional wrestling that it got a lot of people talking about the promotion from a 18 to 34 demographic. A lot of male demographic, that is, by the way, were watching this because it was cool. It wasn't what they were watching when they were 8 years old. This was hardcore wrestling. This was lucha libre style wrestling. This was Japanese style wrestling. This was blending all of those things in and making it the coolest, this cult-like following that ECW thrived on throughout its years at the top. When you look back on WWF's and WCW involvement with ECW, it is a night and day different. Eric Bischoff has famously said in many interviews years past and even recently that he was not a fan of ECW. Was he a fan of some of the ECW talent? Absolutely. Was he a fan of some of the styles maybe ECW was bringing in the mid-90s, the lucha libre and Japanese style of wrestling? While he probably won't admit that it was ECW where he first seen it, and he doesn't really like to admit that ECW brought it to North America, and he believes he did, with WCW Nitro, really showcasing the cruiserweight division, and of course lucha libre, Japanese style of wrestling. It was Paul Heyman that did it, and Eric Bischoff did acquire a lot of the talent for a lot more money. You can't really blame any of the talent for leaving in ECW when they did, because they went over to much bigger checks, more money in their bank accounts, and a bigger platform to showcase their skills. Now, when it comes to the WWF side of things, and Vince McMahon specifically, it all kind of leads into the original ECW invasion in 1995 at the King of the Ring event, in ECW's home base of Philadelphia. Now, whether or not Vince McMahon knew about ECW beforehand, I'm sure he did, but in storyline-wise, Vince McMahon first became aware of ECW at this event in 1995. The crowd was chanting EC-Dub, EC-Dub. Famously, that has become such a, even to this day, a mainstay chant within wrestling crowds, but I digress. But on September 22nd, 1996, at the In Your House Mind Games event in Philadelphia, ECW stars The Sandman, Tommy Dreamer, Paul Heyman, and Taz were front row, with Sandman even interfering in one match. He threw a beer on Savio Vega during the strap match with Bradshaw. McMahon famously, he acknowledged ECW's status as a local up-and-coming promotion on the air, which is something that, we look back on it now and it's probably viewed at as such a weird line that nobody really paid any attention to, but you look back on it now and where we know ECW went to and how everything unfolded, it's just one of those things that kind of just stick out to me in the terms of what WWF's role in was ECW this entire time, because they did view them as something, they were definitely not number one, they were not number two, but I would say that at one point, or even throughout this entire journey within ECW's existence, they were number three. But to Vince McMahon and maybe to Eric Bischoff, they were not competition. They were someone they could utilize to maybe produce stars in, whichever way you want to look at it, whether it was more of a working relationship that WWF seemed to have with ECW, even having the original ECW invasion in the mid-90s, or whether it was looked at as something as Eric Bischoff just coming in and taking talent from ECW. It was still a breeding ground for talent coming up, because even in this ECW invasion in the mid-90s, the original ECW invasion I should say, we had people that were kind of coming into WWF at the time from ECW, and kind of looking at that roster as a whole and where they a lot of these talent would end up. ECW was a place where talent was developing. Whether people loved ECW or not, there are of course the talent that stayed there throughout the entire duration and were not really planning on leaving. If you wanted to make money, if you wanted to make real money within the professional wrestling world, you had to wrestle in WCW or WWF if you're wrestling in America. That's just where it was. So a lot of these talent were just stepping stones. ECW was used as a stepping stone to get to another place. However, it's not a knock on the talent, it's not even a knock on WWF or WCW. Sure, their maybe way they went about it was a little bit different in acquiring talent from ECW, but you have to kind of look at it on a grand scheme of things of like, A, the talent's making more money, and B, they're gonna get to showcase their skills on a much larger scale. However, that's not really saying anything about what the actual ECW product was. Even in times of the invasion and everything that was going on with talent kind of jumping in, you were seeing a lot of talent that you weren't seeing anywhere else in ECW. Talents like the names of Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Jericho, Rey Mysterio Jr., Chris Benoit, Mick Foley, Steve Austin. The list kind of goes on and on and on about all these stars. Everyone that I kind of mentioned there went on to a very big level of success within WCW and WWE. There was talent that were getting, when we talk about Steve Austin and we talk about Mick Foley, they were let go by WCW in the early 90s and then kind of got to really knock down a few more doors when they come to ECW, because ECW was not something that was micromanaged. It wasn't something that was like, here, this is what we're going to do. It was like letting the talent do what they do best. Promos were very different in ECW, and I think a lot of people don't even really maybe piece this together, but I feel like a lot of this promo style of this backstage kind of very quiet, direct to the kind of camera style was really reintroduced into wrestling, and of course it had times within wrestling that we kind of adapted to within WWE or WCW and beyond. But we kind of reintroduced this kind of style of like direct to the camera during the pandemic when there was no fans. ECW did a lot of pre-tape segments like that where it was direct to the camera. They were talking to you at home because they had more of a chance of getting that kind of style over than say something flashy vignette that was going on at the time within WCW and WWF. The mid-90s was such a pivotal time in the world, and ECW was kind of trying to really put that into a bubble and say, this is what the world is doing right now, and we're going to bring it to professional wrestling. And again, when you look at something like what Eric Bischoff said, how Vince McMahon was kind of approaching this, even Vince himself has said, hey, I knew that the ECW style in a whole was not going to work on a mainstream scale. However, I can kind of adapt elements of ECW and put it into my program. ECW was the start of the Attitude Era. Yes, you do look at what WCW was doing, and they did go to a more reality-based kind of character. Again, something that ECW was doing throughout its duration. But they were going towards that, and it needed something with WWE to change, or WWF at the time. But they took elements of what ECW was doing in 96, 97, 98, with the more hardcore style, with a different style of wrestling. Yes, okay, a lot of people remember that ECW was about blood and guts and this hardcore style where there was no rules, but it also had this other style of wrestling that we weren't seeing in the United States or on a Western world kind of scale. We weren't seeing this lucha libre style, we weren't seeing Japanese style wrestling presented in this way, where the focus was not on blood and guts and barbed wire. It was focused on what was happening inside the ring, the actual wrestling itself. There was an emphasis on great wrestling, and it was mixing it with this kind of hardcore, balls to the wall style that ECW promoted and ECW thrived on. But that style was adapted into WCW when you look at the Cruiserweight division, where it was focused on the wrestling. It was put into WWF with the style of the Hardcore Championship and just that kind of more brutal style that you've seen. You look at Mick Foley coming into WWF in 1996 with the Mankind character, and then bringing in Cactus Jack and bringing in that style that you would see on a weekly basis on Monday Night Raw when the Attitude Era was thriving. There's so many elements that kind of come into the mainstream scale of what Paul Heyman and ECW were doing in the mid to late 90s. Paul Heyman's biggest issue with ECW throughout its entire time that it was even a thing was building an audience outside of the cult-like following they had done. And because their content was so, no pun intended, extreme, was so violent, was so edgy, it was very hard to get a television deal for ECW outside of syndication at 2 or 3 in the morning. You're not going to make a lot of money off that time. Yes, ECW was that gritty style of wrestling that people loved, but it wasn't going to expand out of that unless you could kind of get a little bit more of a production value in your show. The way you do that is television deals, is a big way you can do that. Now, of course, Raw and Nitro both had national television deals with USA and TNT respectively. Now, the only way that ECW was going to be able to at least compete and to able to make some money within ECW itself was to get this. And in 1999, Heyman would sign a 3-year, at that point, contract with TNN in hopes of expanding national awareness of the company. Hopefully, he was going to gain some money for this company so it could thrive for many, many more years. ECW shows, like I said before, were only shown via syndication. TNN, I should say, wanted to add ECW to its Friday night Thrill Zone lineup in an attempt to help build and increase the teenager, young male viewership that they had kind of been trying to gather throughout that time. In 2000, the network claimed a vast improvement in the young male demographic on Friday nights due to ECW's addition. Now, when I alluded to the very violent, very edgy, very extreme content that ECW was producing during this time, of course, I'm going to bring up the fact of TNN are now involved. A national television network is now involved with ECW. So, of course, there's not going to be any issues, right? It's just going to all be fine. Wrong. Of course, the program would need to be toned down from the usual ECW kind of style that cult-like following thrived on. They emphasized more of the violent matches and explicit content than what WWF and WCW was offering, even in the thick of the Attitude Era. They were not providing that level of edge that ECW was providing just throughout their violence and throughout their extreme programming that they were putting on. It was noted many years later on the Rise and Fall of ECW DVD that came out, the documentary that came out, that former ECW producer Ron Buffone stated that TNN provided ECW with a very small budget to produce the program while simultaneously asking for high quality production on par with Nitro and Raw. Does that make any kind of sense to anybody of how you're meant to do that on a very small budget, but have the production levels that Raw and Nitro were doing, especially on the Nitro side of things? Raw was starting in 1998, 1999 to really up their production value, but Nitro had millions and millions of dollars throughout the Ted Turner kind of stuff that they were, Ted Turner's money, that network and that company had. They were at a production level that ECW wouldn't even be able to dream of having with the finances that they have available to them. It just wasn't a thing. And that was the kind of spiral of everything that led to the end of the ECW on TNN run. So ECW on TNN's run lasted 13 and a half months. It was originally a 3-year deal. It was the kind of genesis and the nail on the coffin for what was becoming the end of ECW. After ECW on TNN came to an end, on September 25th, 2000, Monday Night Raw would move to TNN, and this was kind of, I guess you could say, the beginning of the end for everything with ECW after losing its television deal. It was producing video games, it was producing pay-per-views, but nothing, especially at that time. You could even make an argument that now it's just not going to make you money unless you're on television, unless you're on a television network. He believes, and Paul Heyman I mean when I refer to he, Paul Heyman believes that ECW on TNN was a trial for Monday Night Raw on TNN, and he'll believe that till, I think, the cows come home with everything. A lot of workers within ECW also back up that statement. They believe it was a trial run. That's all it was, and their edgy content was never going to last the full 3-year deal, and that was the kind of beginning of the end for everything with ECW. By the year 2000, financial problems began rocking the company. That October, ECW on TNN was cancelled, with the final episode airing on October 6, 2000 in favour of WWF Raw moving to the network. ECW struggled for months after the cancellation, trying to secure a new television deal, but it wasn't possible. On December 30, 2000, ECW Hardcore TV aired for the last time, and the January 7, 2001 broadcast of Guilty as Charged was the company's last pay-per-view. They were planning to do more pay-per-views, they were planning to try and get more television. It all come down to money. Officially, ECW closed on April 4th, 2001. In March of that year in 2001, they were scheduling a Living Dangerously show. Again, financial troubles just weren't able to make it happen. Heyman would make his debut on Monday Night Raw, becoming a color commentator, replacing Jerry Lawler. Vince McMahon announced that he had acquired ECW in that year, after acquiring WCW. He had all assets to their library, he would not purchase contracts, he just wanted their library, and some of the talent would come over from ECW. It was one of the most impactful, if not the most impactful day in wrestling history. It was the most impactful year in wrestling history, perhaps even the most impactful wrestling month ever that has ever occurred in professional wrestling. When you think of competition, when you think of the Attitude Era, you think of the Monday Night Wars. You think of WCW Nitro beating Monday Night Raw in the ratings for 83 weeks. You think of those two companies. However, you also think about the Attitude Era, you also think about ECW. You think of ECW's impact on professional wrestling, on WWE, on WCW. They made their mark. They were the number 3 company. There was no question that they were not the top company. That wasn't happening. That wasn't ever what they aspired to do. They knew they couldn't compete with that level of finance, with that level of production. It just wasn't a possibility. But what was a possibility, it was creating something different, was creating an alternative, was being cool, was being what wrestling became in a lot of ways. ECW was the influential company of the 3. They changed the industry, and still a lot of ECW bleeds into today's product. You see it on a lot of different things. Hardcore wrestling fans, whatever way you want to look at that, view ECW as a golden time in all of professional wrestling. When Vince McMahon acquired ECW, when he purchased ECW, it was the end of a true era in professional wrestling. Now, as we go from ECW's death, if you want to call it that, we go into 2001, when Vince McMahon had acquired all of this stuff, all of the libraries, he did, of course, acquire a lot of debt from ECW and WCW in a certain kind of way as well. But he also did have this kind of access to the most talent that have ever been available to work under the WWF banner in 2001. There had never been that much talent that have worked so freely, and they were all free agents, essentially. A lot of them, I'm not saying all of them, a lot of WCW talent had contracts that went beyond just buying it out. They would let themselves kind of sit at home and make money. ECW had a lot of financial problems with a lot of overdue people not getting paid, so WWE would acquire them in some ways. But the alliance would begin, the invasion would begin in 2001. Now, it's looked at just this mixed reception with the alliance. We all realize what the invasion could have been and how big it could have been if done super correctly, but a lot of the talent was just not available at the time. It would originally start with the WCW alliance and WCW invasion in the mid-2001 time, but ECW would be acquired in the storyline world that Stephanie McMahon had bought ECW and Shane McMahon had bought WCW. This would last on for months throughout the WWE programming on both Raw and SmackDown, culminating at Survivor Series in 2001 with WWF, of course, defeating the alliance and ridding the invasion from WWF programming. It's going to be interesting to kind of see how people react to me talking about the invasion, the alliance, because it is such a touchy subject for so many people, because 2001, in March of 2001, when this all happened, people viewed it as a huge chapter and a huge chunk of professional wrestling ending. Whether you were a WWF fan, whether you're a WCW fan, or whether you were an ECW fan, it was the end of an era in professional wrestling, a true golden age in professional wrestling that hasn't really been able to be recaptured or reimagined in so many ways until recently, really. WWF would kind of own the professional wrestling world in a lot of sense. There was WWF, and then there wasn't much else below that for many, many years. So this was the kind of the end of an era, an end of a time within professional wrestling that people look back so fondly of is ECW and WCW and WWF and the Attitude Era. People look at that with such high regard and a time that we will never truly forget. But once the end of the alliance was over and the end of the invasion, ECW stars would make their way into WWF on Raw and SmackDown throughout the early part of the 2000s. People like Rob Van Dam would make their presence felt, Steven Richards, Tommy Dreamer. People like that would make their presence felt within WWE and would become stars in WWE. You look at stars like Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Chris Jericho, they all made their name for themselves in ECW and then going on to WCW and other things as well, but they would make their name in ECW. People like Rhino, people like the Dudley Boys. There were so many people that were popping up in WWE post-invasion time, and it was an exciting time in that sense of like, where are we going to see people that we loved in the late 90s and early 2000s pop up on Raw or SmackDown? It was truly an exciting time in that sense, and we would still kind of feel that ECW vibe within WWF programming, even on the kind of slower side of things. It wasn't what it was but certainly there was leftover parts of ECW in the WWE product in the early 2000s. By 2005, WWE began reintroducing ECW through content from the ECW video library and a series of books, which included the release of the Rise and Fall of ECW documentary on DVD. With heightened and rejuvenated interest in the ECW franchise, WWE organized ECW One Night Stand on June 12, 2005, a reunion event that featured ECW alumni. This event would go down as one of the most wild, insane, crazy nights under a WWE banner. You gotta remember, WWE were producing this event, but it was all handled by Paul Heyman. It had Joey Styles on commentary. It had a long list of ECW talent that you fell in love with in ECW, and a lot of WWE talent that had gone on to WWE from ECW and were wrestling under old personas. For example, Lionheart, Chris Jericho opened the show with Lance Storm, both men who were wrestling or wrestled for WWE after ECW had been and gone, I guess you could say, and they were wrestling in their ECW gear and they had an ECW vibe. Of course, this show was held in the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York. It had the ECW flair and ECW flavor that you wanted. It had violence, it had great wrestling, it had everything that you wanted, and of course was kind of centered around the fact that Raw and SmackDown were sending in their kind of like anti-ECW crusaders, led by JBL over on SmackDown, or Kurt Angle over on SmackDown. JBL, Kurt Angle, those two, who, by the way, Kurt Angle famously has said that he was going to debut for ECW in 1997 or 98, and some stuff happened that you can go and do a Google search of, and you'll know that he famously kind of left ECW and went on to WWF. However, it was led by him, JBL, and on the Raw side of things, it was led by Eric Bischoff, who we've talked about many times of how he treated ECW in those years. And it was kind of centered around that. There was a lot of promo work by Paul Heyman and Rob Van Dam, and a lot of back and forth, a lot of stuff that you wouldn't expect WWE to produce under their name and under their banner, but ECW were able to use their kind of extreme, violent kind of stuff that they do in the ring, and also very offensive, suggestive language. It was all kind of there. Maybe not to the height of ECW in the 90s, but it was 2005 and the world had evolved a little. So it was kind of a little different with how they had to present it, but it was still ECW. ECW One Night Stand 2005 was a big, huge deal, and it felt so real, and it felt truly like the last time that we would ever see these ECW talents in this environment ever again. We weren't going to ever see this again. However, in 2006, on June 11th, ECW One Night Stand 2, I guess you could say, would come about purely due to financial and critical success of the production that they produced in 2005. However, this one was a little bit different. It was the debut of the relaunch of the ECW franchise as a third WWE brand, but it was also featured as ECW versus WWE. You had matches like the main event being Rob Van Dam and John Cena for the WWE Championship, Rob Van Dam cashing in his Money in the Bank. So it was a little bit different. It still had a lot of elements of ECW, but it definitely did feel like WWE's One Night Stand. It felt like what WWE perceived ECW as, and really toning it down a lot, especially from the 90s and the thriving ECW time. Even different though from ECW One Night Stand 2005. It was certainly different. It did have a lot of the hardcore elements. If you look at that the 6-person tag team match that they had with Tommy Dreamer and Terry Funk and Bull McGillicuddy versus Lita, Edge, and Mick Foley, it had elements of ECW in it, but there was other things that happened. There was like a disqualification on that show. There was certainly some opinions going out with how we perceived 2005 and 2006's One Night Stand kind of vibes, but definitely different. After the events of One Night Stand 2006, ECW would launch as a third brand. Now, initially it was produced a little differently from Raw or SmackDown. For televised events, the main ring facing cameras were placed at a different location in the arena, while the wrestling ring itself featured an ECW logo on the mat and blank turnbuckle covers. So, there was different things going on within the actual zone of ECW to make it feel a little bit different from Raw or SmackDown. The male performers were referred to as extremists instead of superstars, while female performers were called vixens instead of divas. Now, this wouldn't last all that long. We know from the very first episode of ECW on Sci-Fi in 2006 when a zombie came out, it was not going to be like ECW was. Originally, all matches were held under quote-unquote ECW rules, but later, very quickly I should add, it was pretty much the same formula as Raw or SmackDown. It was filmed the same way, it looked the same way, everything just became WWE's third brand. You would have some matches held under Extreme Rules. I believe every single week there was at least one. That slowly went away, and everything was just crumbling before our very eyes. Now, Paul Heyman was actually included in the ECW relaunch in 2006 from the time it came back up until the infamous December to Dismember pay-per-view, which featured an Extreme Elimination Chamber main event. This show, I never really say this about wrestling as a whole, this show was really bad. Like, really bad. Not even sometimes funny bad, where you can kind of look at it and laugh at it. It was just really bad and really unfortunate. December to Dismember was what I believed when the ECW relaunch really died, and we knew what we were getting, and we knew what this had become, and Vince McMahon's vision of ECW as a property versus Paul Heyman's vision as ECW as a property were definitely not the same. Paul Heyman would leave WWE after December to Dismember. In the story you've all heard, there was a plane ride, there was many different things, there was a lot of creative differences, and it was just kind of the end of that. It just crumbled after that. We had Bobby Lashley as the ECW champion to end 2006. In 2007, Vince McMahon himself would become the ECW champion. It would get really bad. And sure, there were some elements of the ECW relaunch that were good, and I do truly believe this when I say this. I believe the ECW relaunch could have survived if that third brand was called anything but ECW, because we held a certain level of love and value with the ECW name that we didn't want anything to tarnish it, and that's exactly what was happening in 2007 and the latter part of 2006. It really was just crumbling before our very eyes, and before we knew it, by 2008, 2009, ECW was just, it was not even, there was no even at all resemblance of what ECW was in its heyday. There wasn't even an ECW resemblance of what it was at the beginning of the rebrand or the relaunch. There just was nothing to it. It just became another WWE show, and it truly does make you sad. There is some elements that I really like. Again, if it wasn't called ECW, it'd be a great little show that was just kind of tucked away as WWE's third brand. But it just was what it was. It died a very horrible, slow death, and it was the end of ECW. A lot of people do not credit this ECW as ECW. They do not pay attention to this ECW, and I think a lot of people truly believe that ECW came to an end in 2001 and it had one revival show in 2005. A lot of people might view it as 2006's One Night Stand as the end, but I think a lot of ECW loyalists and people true to that brand view ECW dying, if you want to call it that, or coming to an end in 2001 and then having a revival show. That was basically everything there was with ECW. This WWE ECW was not ECW, and eventually it would be announced that ECW would be going off the air and it would air its final episode on February 16th. The final match on the show was an Extreme Rules match where Ezekiel Jackson defeated then ECW champion Christian. And that was the end of WWE's version of ECW. In the year 2021, ECW lives in a lot of our hearts as one of the most influential times in professional wrestling history. We still see it in today's wrestling, we still see signs of ECW, we still have ECW chants. And while ECW may have been the first victim of the Monday Night Wars between Nitro and Raw, ECW lives a lot longer than the legacies of other companies and other passions that we've had in our lives. ECW truly lives in our hearts, it lives in our minds, it lives on the WWE network now. There's so many things about ECW that we could just sit here and reminisce about. But one thing that I'll know with ECW and what I'll always take away in the legacy of ECW is that it changed professional wrestling forever. I hope you've enjoyed this legacy of ECW, the biggest legacy of I have ever attempted. It truly means the world that you've listened this entire time, that you've watched this entire video. If you can, please leave a like, leave a sub, ring the bell, all that kind of good stuff, and let me know in the comments below and on social media what you think about this legacy of. I thank you so much for listening to this. We'll be back to our regularly scheduled legacy of on Monday with the legacy of Sasha Banks, but I hope you've loved this. Just share the hell out of this, give it some love, let me know what you think. And thank you for supporting me and this series and Love Wrestling, everything that we do. All of the links to my stuff, Love Wrestling stuff, as always, is in the description below. I will see you next Monday for more The Legacy of. Bye!